Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
When I needed surgery, my mom cried and said, "We're tight on money, sweetie. We just can't swing it right now." 32 days later, they bought my brother a jet ski. With a bow on it. I wish I could say I was shocked, but in reality, I just laid there in the hospital bed, my stitches tugging with every breath, and four humming softly beside me, and stared at the photo on Facebook like it was some kind of cruel joke. One I hadn't been let in on, even though I was clearly the punchline. There they were, Mom and Dad, beaming like lottery winners, squinting in the sun next to Danny and his new Sea-Doo, arms thrown over each other's shoulders like they hadn't just let their only daughter go through abdominal surgery completely alone, fighting insurance claims and maxed-out cards like some kind of solo gladiator. And Danny, my charming, golden boy brother, grinning in mirrored sunglasses, holding a beer, giving a thumbs up next to the caption, "Surprise gift for the best son we could ask for." It felt like acid burning its way through the center of my chest, not just because of the betrayal, though that was loud and bright and impossible to ignore, but because somewhere deep down, I had actually believed them when they said they couldn't help. I had sat there on their old couch in the living room, my hands twisting in my lap, explaining that my pain wasn't going away, that the doctors had found something with a long name, something that wasn't life-threatening but still needed to be dealt with, and soon. And Mom had clasped her hands like a character in a sad movie and said, "We're so sorry, honey. We just don't have anything to give right now. Everything's so tight lately, you know how it is." Of course, I nodded. Of course, I told them it was okay. I always tell them it's okay. That's been my job in this family from the beginning, the forgiver, the adjuster, the one who doesn't make things harder than they already are. But that night, alone in my apartment, curled around a heating pad with an unopened bill sitting on the kitchen counter, I realized just how tired I was of playing that role. And when I finally collapsed in the shower a few weeks later, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint as the tiles spun around me, I wasn't even surprised. I came to in the ER, the overhead lights searing into my skull, nurses asking me my name and birthday like I was some stranger dropped into a world I didn't recognize. The surgery happened fast after that, a blur of consent forms and hurried explanations, clipped voices, and sharp pain. It wasn't a complicated operation, at least not to the doctors, but the recovery was brutal in the way only real, quiet suffering can be. No visitors. No flowers. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights, the sting of unreturned texts, and the cold realization that when I truly needed them, my family was nowhere. I kept thinking maybe they'd show up. That at least Mom would come sit at the edge of the bed and bring me a cup of that bad hospital coffee, tell me she was sorry, brush my hair like she used to when I was a kid. But the only thing that came through my phone was a message from her on day 3. "Hang in there. We love you. Call us when you're up for it." I didn't call. Instead, I scrolled through social media, watched videos on silent autoplay, read articles I couldn't remember 2 seconds later, and tried not to feel like I was rotting from the inside out. The human body is strange when it's healing. It doesn't ask permission to make you remember everything you tried to bury. Pain pulls up old memories like teeth from tar, and what I kept replaying wasn't just the missed surgery help, but the 100 little cuts that came before it. The time they made me cancel a college trip because Danny wasn't emotionally stable after a breakup. The Christmas I spent alone because they had to fly to Florida to help Danny move. The emergency money I lent them for a sudden plumbing disaster that later turned out to be the down payment on Danny's secondhand truck. Every time I pushed aside my own needs, telling myself they just didn't have the capacity, just didn't have the money, just didn't have the time. But now I saw it for what it was, an unspoken rule in our family that Danny got to be the son, and I was supposed to revolve quietly around him. So when I saw the post, Mom holding her son out in the wind, Dad squinting behind those terrible aviators, Danny with his arms spread wide next to the jet ski, its gleaming red body shining in the sun like a symbol of everything they couldn't give me. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even flinch. I just took a screenshot. And then I took another. And then I closed the app, laid back against my pillow, and stared at the ceiling as something cold and sharp began forming inside me. Not rage. Not sadness. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. It was a plan. Not the kind of plan you scribble down in a spiral notebook with angry bullet points. Not some scorched earth fantasy where you burn every bridge and scream into the void. No, this plan would take time. It would require silence, observation, precision. It wouldn't even look like revenge at first. But by the time they realized what had happened, by the time they saw what I had started that day in that hospital bed, it would be far too late to undo. And they'd never see it coming. There's something eerily quiet about hospital rooms once the nurses finish their checks and the lights dim into that artificial half-night, not dark enough to let your body rest, not bright enough to let your mind stay focused, just that sterile, grayish haze that seeps into your bones and makes every minute stretch like taffy pulled too far, threatening to snap. I spent 6 days in that bed, my abdomen stitched up like a patchwork doll, with nothing but the humming of machines and the clatter of distant carts to remind me that somewhere beyond those walls, people were still living lives that didn't hurt every time they laughed or coughed or shifted the wrong way. And in that endless stillness, I started remembering things, not the happy, polished memories families like to post in holiday cards, but the raw, unfiltered flashes of childhood that show you who people really are when the spotlight isn't on. Growing up, my brother Danny was the kind of kid who could crash a bicycle into a parked car and have the neighbors laughing about how adventurous he was, while I could get a B on a math test and be met with solemn disappointment and questions about missed potential. He wasn't a bad person, not then, not really, just someone who had grown up in a home where he never had to apologize for the space he took up. I, on the other hand, learned to shrink early, to keep my tone even, to pick up the slack when Mom was tired and Dad was stressed and Danny forgot again. I was the responsible one, the one who cleaned the house when guests came over, even though nobody noticed, the one who didn't slam doors, the one who didn't scream. That conditioning doesn't leave you easily. Even now, at 32, lying in a bed with surgical tape peeling off my skin and bruises blooming under the foreline, I felt guilty for being there, for needing care, for not being the one fixing everything. I had gone into this procedure thinking it would be the hard part, the pain, the recovery, the slow climb back to normalcy. But it turned out that the hardest part wasn't the incision or the nausea or the loneliness. The hardest part was realizing that nobody was coming, that I had no one to text when the morphine wore off too soon, no one to pick up the cheap flower bouquet I hadn't ordered for myself, that my parents, who had always claimed to do their best with what they had decided I wasn't worth stretching for. 3 days after the jet ski photo, my mother finally showed up. She didn't come alone, either. She brought her work phone, which she answered twice during her 34-minute visit, and a bag of soggy Chinese takeout that she insisted she'd picked up just for me, even though the receipt was from 2 hours earlier. She didn't ask how the surgery had gone. She didn't mention the photos or the surprise gift or even say the word Danny. She just talked about her job, about a neighbor's dog who'd gotten out again, about how tired she was and how stressful things had been lately. I listened, nodding when appropriate, too drained to do anything else. When she left, she kissed my forehead like I was a child with a scraped knee, not a woman who had been sliced open and stitched back together by strangers because her own parents had tighter fists than hearts. That night, after the pain meds dulled enough for my brain to start working again, I opened my notes app and began writing. Not a journal, not a place for feelings or affirmations or any of that soft nonsense. I started writing facts, dates, account names, passwords I remembered hearing over dinner. My dad's old PIN that he used for everything. The name of the bank they switched to after Danny's first DUI, the one they pretended was too complicated for me to help manage. I wasn't sure what I was building at first, just a scaffolding of memory, a structure made of overlooked details. But as the days passed and the pages filled up, something took shape. Not revenge, exactly. Not yet. Just a sense of readiness. I started thinking about all the times I'd heard them whisper about refinancing the house, about restructuring the loan for Danny's sake, about how they used to ask me to sign things without reading them when I was in college, just formalities, Mom said. About how Dad kept calling me by my full legal name when he needed my signature, which had always felt weird, but never weird enough to question until now. And then, one night, when the nurse changed my bandages and stepped out, I logged into my old email, the one linked to our shared family documents folder from years ago, and typed in a password I hadn't used since I was 21. It still worked. Inside, tucked between grocery lists and family calendars and outdated tax documents, I found a PDF labeled House_Refi_Final_2017. I opened it. I read it. And when I saw my signature, in perfect blue cursive, at the bottom of the page, a page I had never laid eyes on in my life, I didn't cry. I laughed. Just once. Low. Cold. Because now I had proof. I had leverage. I had history on my side. The next day, Danny posted a video of himself speeding across the lake on his brand new jet ski, beer in one hand, life jacket open, shouting into the wind like a man who had never tasted consequence in his life. I watched the clip from my hospital bed, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. I didn't comment. I didn't text. I didn't say a word. But I added a new note. Danny's employer, Welch Automotive, family-owned. HR email public. Because if my parents thought they could gut me financially and emotionally and still parade around like heroes with their favorite child in tow, then they had grossly misunderstood who I was. And if Danny thought he could coast through life on charm and water toys, untouched by the damage his success was built on, he was about to learn what happens when the quiet one finally starts talking, not out loud, but in exactly the right places. And I wasn't even close to done. They say that time heals all wounds, but whoever came up with that nonsense clearly never sat in a silent apartment, surrounded by medical bills, unopened condolence cards from coworkers who meant well, and the echo of their mother's voice saying, "I'm so proud of how independent you are, Rachel," as though independence was some shiny badge I had willingly pinned to my own chest, instead of something I'd been cornered into wearing since I was old enough to reach the sink on my own. Recovery was slow, not just in the physical sense, though every step felt like punishment for trusting too easily, but in the way I had to relearn what it meant to exist without waiting for someone to swoop in and fix things. Because now I knew no one was coming. Not my parents, not Danny, not some divine stroke of karma to balance out the scales. I was, as always, on my own. And yet, oddly, that knowledge didn't hollow me out the way it used to, it sharpened me. In the weeks that followed my release from the hospital, I went back to work with a tight smile and a quiet determination that most people mistook for stoicism. I didn't correct them. I let the assumption sit. People see what they want to see. I'd learned that a long time ago, and if they wanted to believe I was resilient instead of unraveling, then that was fine by me. Let them. What they didn't see, what no one saw, was what I was doing in the early mornings, long before the office filled with the smell of burnt coffee and forced laughter. They didn't see me poring over every financial record I could dig up from my past, cross-referencing tax documents, comparing old account numbers, and tracing money transfers with the obsessive precision of someone who had finally stopped lying to herself about her place in the family hierarchy. Because here's the thing, when someone shows you how little you matter, not just with words but with actions, when they choose a wave runner and a weekend at the lake over your literal health, you start to notice the little betrayals too. The ones you shrugged off before because they didn't seem worth the fight. Like the fact that I'd had a savings account once, a modest one, sure, but it was something I started in high school with birthday money and babysitting cash, and I'd kept adding to it during college. I hadn't touched it since my 20s, and after a few job changes and one relocation, I had assumed it had been quietly absorbed into some other account. Maybe moved under my parents' oversight as a precaution back when they were still pretending to be supportive. But now, with fresh eyes and no more delusions, I started asking questions I should have asked years ago. It didn't take long to find the answer. I called the bank, verified my identity, and asked about the closed account, the one that used to have just over $8,000 in it. The rep on the phone, a young guy who sounded like he was eating cereal while talking, pulled up the record and casually told me the account had been closed 6 years ago by one of the joint holders, my father, with the remaining balance transferred to a new account under the name D. Hastings. Danny. There was no pause. No check and ask if I was okay. No concern over what that might mean. Just, would you like to reopen a personal account with us today, Ms. Hastings? I hung up. I didn't cry. Instead, I sat in my car outside the grocery store and stared out at the sun-bleached parking lot while the edges of my vision pulsed with something darker than sadness. $8,000. My emergency fund. My safety net. Wiped clean and funneled into my brother's hands without so much as a courtesy call. And now it was gone, probably traded in for a bottle of tequila and a week's worth of jet fuel. That night, I poured myself a drink, opened my laptop, and revisited Danny's social media. Public, of course. Danny had always been shameless in his pursuit of validation. He wanted the world to see every shirtless lake photo, every steak dinner, every group shot with women who looked like they had been filtered within an inch of their lives. He was tagging his employer in most of them, Welch Automotive, a mid-sized, family-run car dealership that prided itself on trust, tradition, and class. I scrolled through tagged posts, checked the company page, clicked through employee reviews. I wasn't looking for a scandal. I wasn't planning anything, not yet. But then I remembered something, the DUI. It happened in college, right before his senior year, kept quiet, of course, thanks to a friend in the force and a last-minute lawyer. My parents had paid for it to disappear, called it a youthful mistake, and instructed me never to bring it up. I hadn't. Until now. I opened a new email address. Something untraceable. I drafted a message to Welch Automotive's HR department. I kept it vague, polite, with just enough breadcrumbs to make them curious. An anonymous tip regarding a past DUI conviction of a public-facing employee, concerned for the company's image, perhaps worth reviewing his background check records. I didn't sign it. I didn't even send it that night. I saved it as a draft, stared at it for an hour, and finally clicked send at 2:40 in the morning. 2 days later, Danny posted a photo from his desk with the caption, "Rough week." People love to dig up old dirt when you're finally happy. The comments were sympathetic. Haters gonna hate. Ignore the noise, bro. You're doing amazing, sweetie. But I knew. I knew what had landed in his lap. I knew that someone had pulled his file, dusted it off, and started asking the kind of questions that never end with a simple answer. And I knew he hadn't told our parents. Not yet. Because in our family, perception is everything. And Danny would rather go down with the ship than admit he wasn't perfect. I watched the fallout from a distance, quiet, deliberate, invisible. And it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in weeks. They'd taken my savings. They'd taken my trust. So I took something intangible. Something that couldn't be returned with a receipt or replaced with a phone call. I took control. There's a strange kind of theater that plays out at family gatherings when everyone involved is pretending not to notice that the foundation is already cracked beneath them, that aching, awkward choreography where each person smiles just a little too wide, pours wine just a little too fast, and steers every conversation towards safer waters like weather or grilling temperatures, or the way the dog has been shedding more than usual. When my parents invited me to the 4th of July dinner at the lake house, the one they bought after tight finances forced them to say no to helping me with surgery, I already knew the invitation wasn't a peace offering. It was damage control. The dinner was pitched in Mom's usual cheery tone, full of "we've missed you" and "you'll love what we've done with the patio," as if our last several months hadn't unfolded like a quiet war, full of silences and digital betrayals and a kind of calculated coldness I had never known myself capable of, and yet had come to rely on, like armor. I accepted the invitation with the same warmth she offered it, feigned delight in my voice, even told her I'd bring dessert, just to watch her exhale with that nervous little relief that said she'd already expected me to say no. But I wasn't showing up to make amends. I was showing up to confirm what I already suspected, that the narrative they were telling themselves about our family, about me, was still clinging to life, barely, and that I was going to be the one to pull the final thread loose. It was one of those aggressively festive summer days, where the heat made everything shimmer and the air smelled like cut grass, burnt charcoal, and mosquito repellent. The lake house looked exactly as I remembered it, picture perfect from the outside, with white-trimmed windows and rocking chairs on the porch. An American flag flapping proudly in the breeze, as if patriotism alone could keep the wood from warping or the lies from seeping in through the cracks. Inside, it was cooler, brighter, cleaner than I'd expected. Mom had lit one of those lemon-scented candles she swore by and was bustling between the kitchen and the outdoor grill with the kind of nervous energy that only reveals itself when someone is trying very hard to pretend that everything is completely normal. Danny was already there, of course, dressed like an Abercrombie ad, khaki shorts, boat shoes, and a polo that looked too new to be casual. He greeted me with a hug that was just 1 second too long, too eager, like a man overcompensating for something he hadn't quite confessed. And maybe he was, because from the way his eyes flicked toward Dad and then back to me, I could tell he was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. He didn't know I had sent the email. He didn't know the extent of what I'd found. But he knew something had shifted, and if he had even a fraction of the self-awareness I doubted he possessed, then he had to feel the tension pressing in around us like a storm just beyond the tree-line. Dinner was fine, if you define fine as barely concealed tension hidden beneath layers of overcooked ribs and store-bought pie. Dad told the same story about the neighbor's sprinkler system malfunctioning. Mom asked me about work with forced interest, nodding too quickly at every answer. Danny, to his credit, kept it light, laughed at his own jokes, complimented the food, teased me about my famous silence, a phrase that would have made me flinch years ago, but now just made me tilt my head and smile like a woman watching someone walk blindly into traffic. They thought they were doing well, holding it together, brushing dust under the rug, pretending the floorboards weren't creaking. They didn't know I already knew about the forged documents, that I'd seen the refinancing papers, the ones with my name printed clean and precise at the bottom, next to a signature that matched mine, but which I had never actually written. They didn't know I'd called the bank, requested a review of the records, and had already spoken to someone in compliance who'd promised a formal look at the application. And yet, I didn't bring any of that up over dinner. I passed the corn. I complimented the pie. I told Mom her hair looked nice. I took a photo of the wine label, just for fun, I said. I posed for a group picture on the dock, the lake behind us calm and golden, the jet ski nowhere in sight, sold off, most likely, after Danny's job started circling the drain. And while they smiled and told each other how grateful they were to have the whole family together again, I stood there with the breeze at my back, my phone buzzing gently in my pocket with a message from a friend in public records. Your parents' loan files are officially under review. Want the case number? I replied with a thumbs up, then deleted the message. Later, when the sun dipped below the tree line and the fireflies started showing up like blinking confessions in the dark, we lit fireworks on the shore. Danny nearly set his own shirt on fire trying to light a bottle rocket. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But while they were distracted by the sky, I was thinking about the next step, about the subtle, surgical way a life can unravel when you just apply the right amount of pressure to the seams. That night, while they all slept under their cozy lakeside roof, I sat in my car at the edge of the driveway, engine off, windows down, listening to the cicadas and the soft lapping of the water, and I uploaded 3 files to an anonymous tip portal. The refinancing agreement, the notary records with mismatched dates, and a screen capture of my own legal signature for comparison. I didn't need to write an explanation. The documents spoke for themselves. And as I drove away, watching the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror, I realized I didn't feel satisfaction. Not exactly. What I felt was control, not the petty kind that comes from revenge served hot and loud, but the quiet, strategic kind that lingers beneath the surface, invisible until the moment it's far too late. The next time they called, I would answer. And I would be smiling. By the time the leaves began turning brittle and red at the edges, curling inward like secrets too old to stay upright, the cracks in the glossy facade my parents had worked so hard to polish were beginning to show in places even they could no longer ignore. The lake house, once the centerpiece of their carefully curated image, had lost its shine, not because the structure itself had changed, But because the people who had once filled it with celebratory noise and orchestrated family photo ops now spoke in quieter tones, held their smiles longer than necessary, and asked questions with their eyes they didn't dare put into words. And me, the daughter they had underestimated, overlooked, and shelved like a book they didn't want to finish, I watched it all from a distance, not with glee, not even with bitterness anymore, but with a strange, hollow sense of completion. As though the story I'd been part of for so long had finally reached the point where the climax had passed, and all that was left were the consequences. Danny, who had once strutted across docks like he owned the world, who had leaned into every camera flash with the easy confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything longer than a moment, had gone quiet on social media. His job at Welch Automotive hadn't ended publicly, no grand announcement, no farewell cake. Just a slow fading out of tagged photos, a few cryptic captions about life shifts and new beginnings, and finally, a full account deactivation that came not long after the HR department received their second anonymous report, this time accompanied by archived footage from a bar night in college that someone, not me, had leaked online with just enough identifying markers to raise red flags. Welch, built on image, couldn't afford even the whisper of scandal. And Danny, once their golden boy, became a liability too heavy to justify. My parents didn't call to tell me. They didn't call at all. I heard it from a neighbor, someone I barely knew, who bumped into me at the pharmacy and said, "It's such a shame what happened with your brother. Must be hard for the family." And I just smiled, feigned surprise, nodded politely, and walked away before my mouth could betray what my heart already knew, that the shame, if it had ever belonged to me, had long since dried up and blown away with the summer heat. What remained was cold, clean, deliberate. It wasn't just the job. The bank had reopened the investigation on the refinancing paperwork, and though they hadn't yet taken legal action, the implications alone were enough to freeze assets, flag the mortgage, and send a thick envelope to my parents' mailbox that Dad opened in the middle of breakfast and, according to Mom's second-hand account, didn't speak a word for the rest of the day. Whether they realized it was me or not, I couldn't say. That was the beauty of it. I had left no signature, no traceable trail, nothing they could point to and say, "Rachel did this." Just a series of collapses, slow and steady, like dominoes tipped by wind instead of a hand. When the lake house went up for sale in late October, the listing was vague, hastily written, and riddled with phrases like "motivated seller" and "price to move," which told me more than any direct confession ever could. I drove out there one last time, not to confront them, not to gloat, but to see the end of it, the physical marker of all the years I'd spent convincing myself that maybe one day I'd be let back into the warm part of the family, that if I played nice, stayed quiet, and kept cleaning up their messes, I might finally be seen as something other than background. The house was quiet. No cars in the driveway. The flagpole was bare. I walked down to the dock, the same dock where Danny had unwrapped his jet ski with that infuriating grin, and I sat there for a long time, watching the water move without urgency, like it knew time better than we ever could. My phone buzzed beside me. It was my father. I let it ring. Then I answered. His voice was smaller than I remembered, like it had been filtered through months of panic and uncertainty and the slow unraveling of a life built on favoring the child who never had to earn anything. He asked me, with only a hint of the authority he used to wield like a weapon, if I knew anything about a subpoena that had arrived that morning, something about fraudulent documents, identity misuse, legal inquiries from the compliance board. He asked if I had ever signed anything without reading it. He asked if I remembered that time he had needed my help, years ago, and how I had always been so trusting. And I, sitting on the same planks where my trust had once been snapped like a brittle branch, looked out at the water and said only this: "You told me you were tight on money. I believed you. I just helped make it true." He was silent for a long time. Then the line went dead. I didn't call back. Later that evening, I drove home in the dark, windows down, the cold cutting at my face, and I thought about what revenge really is: not rage, not violence, not a scream in someone's face, but a series of quiet decisions made in the dark. Decisions that require patience and a kind of pain that doesn't ask to be understood. It's not satisfying in the way movies pretend it is. It doesn't heal the old wounds or erase the years of being second place in a two-child race. But it does something else. It shifts the power. It rewrites the roles. And maybe, just maybe, it leaves the villain wondering whether they were the hero all along, right up until the credits start rolling and they realize they weren't even the main character. They were just the cautionary tale.